how do I feel about TypeScript? Let me go ahead and get this out once and for all. TypeScript, and we can bring up the Wikipedia page. In fact, let's do that. TypeScript is not an enhancement to JavaScript. It is a scripting language for C#. So Wikipedia, TypeScript. So if you were to develop a typed language that was a superset of JavaScript, what you would end up with is something that looks a lot like Go. You would not end up with something that looks at all like C#. So let's see if this is still in here. Anders, or I don't know if it's Anders or Anders. I assume it's Anders because he's Danish, and I don't think they have the diphthong sound. Lead architect of C#, creator of Delphi and Tubar Pascal, has worked on the development of TypeScript. And if you just think about it, C++, this is not people who are familiar with and love JavaScript creating a language to enhance JavaScript. What this is every single project that Microsoft has ever created in C# in the public space outside of Microsoft has failed. All of Microsoft's products that are aimed towards consumers or developers, they all fail. Right? So the Zune failed. I don't know if that had anything to do with C#. That's not really relevant to this, but just Microsoft has a long history of everything that they do fails. Their Metro thing, that failed. I can't remember the other examples. I had 3 or 4 examples that I normally rattle off when somebody asks me this question. I blanket on them right now. But basically, everything Microsoft does in C# fails to gain mainstream attention and adoption. So Microsoft has this army of C# developers, and it turns out that they were wrong and the web succeeded. And so now they have this army of developers who are not skilled at doing what is the most important thing to do, which is web development, and they have to repurpose them. So how are they going to repurpose them? They get the person who created C# to create a scripting language that can almost run in a browser, right? And that is what TypeScript is. So TypeScript is not intended for JavaScript developers. It is intended for C# developers. If you look at all of its complexity with the hierarchical inheritance, also TypeScript is not very good at understanding JavaScript native types. TypeScript is intended to be a bridge for someone that wants to write extremely complex, inheritance-oriented, class-oriented, not object-oriented, but class and inheritance-oriented programming, and they want to bring that to these C# developers so that to make JavaScript more accessible to them. It's not intended to make JavaScript more accessible to web developers. Despite all the hype and they've created great tooling, and you got to give it to them for that. But Microsoft owns GitHub, Microsoft owns NPM. Microsoft is making it so that you get a special badge if you write your repo in TypeScript instead of JavaScript, and so on and so forth. So they have a lot of sway and making it appear cool to use TypeScript. But if you compare software engineering principles, and I've got creedsofcraftsmanship.com, if you want to learn about software engineering, this is my curated list of places to start. And one of the talks that I listened to recently, but that I've been referencing a lot, I think is down here in Just Plain Good Talks, Problem Decomposition, Philosophy of Software Design by John Ousterhout. This was on Talks at Google. It's available on YouTube. I'll go ahead and give you the link right here. But the software engineering principles are in direct contrast with the principles that create something like TypeScript. It doesn't make it easier for people to read or write. It makes it more difficult. Now, that said, the tooling that the TypeScript linter provides, I think, is good tooling. I just wish that it was tooling that was invented with the intention to make it easier to program in JavaScript, rather than bringing C# tooling over to JavaScript. Because I think that if they'd focused on JavaScript, I would be 100% behind a lot of the tooling that they've created and the introspection. But they kind of, pardon my French, but they half-assed it. They didn't buy into JavaScript. And if they had, I think the tooling would just be so excellent. But they kind of said, well, what's the minimum amount of JavaScript that we have to do in order to sell this C# script thing? That's the way that it feels to me when I look at the TypeScript tooling. I get so excited about it because it's so good, except that Not really. I mean, it adds a lot of benefit. I use it myself. I use some JSDoc and I use some of the TSC for type hinting and type linting, but it frustrates me that it doesn't actually implement JavaScript. My thing on TypeScript is that it is not well designed for software engineering. It is designed to transition an army of existing developers over to another tool chain and to utilize the properties that Microsoft owns to generate buzz around it to get people to buy in it through gimmicks like giving badges and whatnot. I think the tooling is great in terms of what it does do for JavaScript, but I wish that they focused more on JavaScript and that it was better as JavaScript tooling. So that's that. The end of rant, other than to say that I really do appreciate the type hinting, type linting thing.